Today's daf is daf Chavav, and we started yesterday the sugya of temed, which means that you poured a certain volume of water, and then following that you put in sediments or grape seeds, and the water soaks up the taste and the color of the grape seeds. And there's a machlokes in the Mishnah in Masos that we mentioned on daf Chaf Hey Amid Beis, machlokes between the Tanakama, the Chacham, and Rabbi Yehuda, in a case where he finds that he still has the same exact volume of water that he started with, and the Chacham therefore say that this is Mayim, it's not Yayin, whereas Rabbi Yehuda says no, despite the fact that you only have the same volume of Mayim, but nevertheless that water has absorbed the taste and the color of the Yayin, and therefore it has a din of Yayin. And the nafkamina to this machlokes about whether the status of this temed is yayin or mayim is going to be with regard to nilkach bekesef maser sheni, meaning you uphold the maser sheni onto mos. Now you have to take these mos and you have to purchase fruits or fruit drinks, and they have to be consumed in Yerushalayim. But water is not something that can be taken with kesef, pidyon, or maser sheni. So therefore, according to Chachamim, since this temed has the status of mayim, therefore you cannot use it to be poda, to purchase this temed for the purpose of kesef, maser sheni, whereas the Rabbi Yehuda would say, no, it has the din of yayin, and therefore it's nilkach bekesef of Maser Sheni. And the Gemara on the top here of Chavav says, Kishehichmitz machlokes. So this is a statement of Rav Nachman that the machlokes only revolves around the case where, in other words, Rabbi Yehuda Shita, that despite the fact that it's the same quantity of mayim, it nevertheless is yayin. That's only because of hichmitz. It fermented. And our Mishnah, which says that at a certain point the temet is considered yayin, and even though the original water and the water that he finds now is equal in volume, but if, as the Mishnah indicates, the combination of mayim and sediments now fermented, then it's called yayin, and that reflects the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. So if we had a whiteboard here to remember, we would say that according to Rav Nachman's understanding, our Mishnah is authored by Rabbi Yehuda. We'll soon see later on that Rabbi Lazar is going to disagree. That's why we have to remember this, because Rabbi Lazar is going to say that our Mishnah goes according to the Chachamim. Now, Rav Nachman, in the name of Rabbi Baravua, this is where we stopped yesterday, on the third line down from the top of Chavav and Aleph, is going to introduce a concept called the mafreya. What does that mean? Tomid shalakocho bekesef maser. So now, at this point in time, when he purchased the temed with kesef maser sheni, then at this point in time, it was not fermented. And therefore, if we would freeze this moment in time, we would say that this transaction is totally null and voided. However, lebasof hichmitz, down the line, it became fermented. And Rav Nachman says that konamaser, that the transaction now is legalized, is valid, my timer, because a gloy milsel mafreya de perahu, because we apply the principle of retroactivity, and we establish that already at the time that he purchased this temed with Kesef Maser Sheni, it was already Yayin. And the proof of the pudding is that now we see that it fermented. So the fermentation then is only what we call a gili milsa. It's only a proof positive that the sediments had given over their taste to the yayin, to the mayim, and the mayim was indeed impacted, although we don't see the actual results until somewhere down the line where eventually it becomes fermented. And now the Gemara is going to raise an objection to this interpretation of Rav Nachman based on our Mishnah. Elamasnisa the Ktani hichmitz in, lo hichmitz lo. Our Mishnah now that establishes that the only new definition or status of this concoction is yayin, of this temet is yayin, is only after it got fermented. But if it hadn't been fermented, it's mayim. Is Dilma Ishavke Havi Machmetz? Why did the Mishnah say in an absolute way that it is yayin and not mayim because there was no fermentation? Why not wait for the eventuality that it would ferment? And now the Gemara is going to offer two defenses to reconcile our Mishnah that makes everything dependent upon Hichmitz with the sheet of Rav Nachman. So we'll start with Rabbah. Omar Rabbah, kisheshir mimenu bekos v'lo hechmitz. The case in our Mishnah is a very unique case. This is what we call an ukimta. The Mishnah is talking about a case where he already tested out this temed and he proved that it did not ferment, meaning he left it there in a cup for enough amount of time that if it would ferment, it should have fermented, but it didn't ferment. So apparently the mayim failed to absorb the sedimentation and the grape seeds. Rava Amar, but Rava wants to suggest that you can reconcile our Mishnah with Rav Nachman without introducing this ukimta, that it's dafkin a case where he tested it out and it stayed for a long time. And Rav is going to say that our Mishnah reflects the sheet of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Hamani Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So now we are sort of shifting our focus from Zroim to Tara in the subject of mikvos. So we'll introduce the new topic with the following introduction. Number one, we have to know that a mikvah has to have 40 sa. 40 sa of mayim, and that water comes directly from the rain into the mikvah. If, on the other hand, the mayim is what's called mayim she'uvim, which means that you took the mayim into a kli, then the halacha is a gimel lugim of mayim she'uvim passes the mikvah. But let's keep in mind, this is the third point of the introduction, that mayim she'uvim passes the mikvah only if it's mayim, but not if it's yayin. Yayin could fall into the mikvah gimel lugim, and garnish could shofar, nothing happened. So now, once again, we're going to get back to the question of temed. Is temed yayin or is it temed mayim? If you have 3 lugim of temed and it's mayim, then it passes the mikvah. On the other hand, if you call it yayin, then it's going to be null set, so to speak. In other words, it's neutral. It doesn't impact or disqualify the mikvah. Now, the last introduction is we have now machlokes in Masechta Mikvos between Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim. What exactly is the determining factor as to whether this was mayim and therefore it passes the mikvah or it's yayin? And Rabbi Yochanan is going to introduce a principle that hakol holech achar amara, that everything depends upon what it looks like. If it's like milk, which looks like water, then it's going to passel the mikveh. But if it's, let's say, temed that already has picked up the color of yayin, so it has the chazusa, meaning the appearance of yayin, then it doesn't passel the mikveh. It's yayin, not mine. And Rava is going to attach that machlokas to our Mishnah. So let's see it now inside. Homani Rabbi Yochanan ben Nurihi. Tistan, we learned in the Mishnah. In Masechta Mikvos, Gimel Lugim Mayim. If 3 lugims worth of water, that's she'uvim, that's taken into a kli. But chaser kurtav, it's not a full 3 lugim. It's missing just a little kurtav. A kurtav means a very small amount. Technically, it means 1/64th of a log. But again, it really means a minute amount. Shenafal esochan kurtav yain. So now he doesn't have a full lugim of mayim she'uvim because he's missing a kurtav. And now he adds to be mashlim to complete the 3 lugim, he adds yain. So now the law depends on whether or not it's mayim and therefore it's mashlim the gimel lugim she'uvim or it's yain. So mar'eim kemara yain v'nofla mikvah lo pasluhu. If this kurtav of yayin looks like water, it has the, like wine, it has the appearance of wine, then it's not considered mayim, and it's not a posel, it doesn't disqualify the mikveh, because we don't have gimel lugim shuvim, we're missing a kurtav, and we're mashling that kurtav with something that looks like yayin. Therefore, lo paslu, we don't have 3 lugim of mayim. But now we have another case. The Mishnah continues and says, Gimel lugim mayim chaser kurtav shenafel sochen kurtav chala mareim kemar mayim nafel mikvah lo pasluhu. Another case where it doesn't passel it, and that's where the hashlama of the Gimel lugim was chalav, because chalav, according to this Tanakama, even though it has the appearance of water of mayim, nevertheless, it's a different entity, and despite the fact that mar'eim kimara mayim, nevertheless, it's not mayim, it's cholav, and therefore you don't have gimel lugim. However, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri omer hakol holech achar mara. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is going to be machmir, he's going to be strict, and he's going to say that this passes the mikvah because cholav, as opposed to yayin, doesn't change the appearance of mayim, but rather it maintains the same appearance. Right? Lav Rabbi Yochanan Basar Chazusa Zlinon. So Rabbi Yochanan's underlying principle on which he based his halachic ruling in mikvos is that everything depends upon chazusa. Chazusa means the way it appears to us. Is therefore hachinami zil basar chazusa v'taimed v'chazusa dahai mayim ninhu. Now we can reflect upon temed according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and therefore we're going to classify temed, since it's unfermented, as mayim, and therefore the transaction with regard to kesef pigeon of Meiser Sheni will not be a valid transaction. And therefore, we can circumvent the whole discussion about Lemafreya and Rav Nachman, who said that, there's machlokas where it eventually became fermented. Forget about all that. That's not relevant. What's all that's relevant now in our Mishnah is whether or not there is some sort of substantial change in the mayim such that it is no longer mayim, either because of chazusa, because its appearance changed to that of wine, and that'll be relevant to the case of mikvos, or because of taima. Taima means the taste. So therefore, even though ultimately the temed is going to ferment, but nevertheless, Everything depends upon the appearance of the temet at the time that the purchase was effectuated. And therefore, what Rav is suggesting is that according to Rabbi Yochanan, temet is going to be treated like water as long as it looks like water, and it tastes like water because it's not fermented. And in this case, the transaction with kesef maser sheni is invalid because it's mayim and not yayin. Now, once we reach the point of fermentation, now it already absorbs the appearance of wine and it tastes like wine, and therefore we can validate the purchase with kesef shenilkach meiser sheni. And the other advantage is that now after fermentation, it's yayin and it's not mayim she'uvim, and it would not passel the mikvah. And all this in our Mishnah is really reflective of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Now, Rav Nachman, on the other hand, he's not following the appearance of the temet. Everything depends, and the legal status is whether or not it ferments eventually, and then we consider it lemafreya as if it was wine at the time of the purchase, even though at that point it looked like water. So he's going to reflect the opinion of the Tanakama, who doesn't put all the emphasis on the appearance of the water, and therefore the determining status is going to be totally dependent upon the moment of fermentation. But now let's go back to Rav Nachman, who introduced the concept of lemafreya, the eventuality that it will ferment. Gemara says, "Upliga de Rabbi Elazar." Rav Nachman was forced to interpret our Mishnah according to Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda puts all the emphasis on the fermentation in the future down the line. Rabbi Elazar is going to interpret our Mishnah according to the Chachamim, and you don't have to introduce Rabbi Yehuda. The Omer Rabbi Elazar, where do we see this? Rabbi Elazar said, "Akol modu sheim mafrishin olav v'mokom acher, the elim kein hichmitz." So Rabbi Elazar says that, let's say, for example, you want to be mafresh maser, and you have temed, and you want to be mafresh from one onto the other. So Rabbi Elazar says everybody agrees, even Rabbi Yehuda, that this hafrasha is not possible. Why? Because although the machlokas revolves around a case where right now it hasn't yet fermented, but Rabbi Yehuda says let's look at it the future, down the line, and therefore kasava Rabbi Elazar holds that below hichmitz machlokes. And now we're going to introduce Rabbi Yehuda, who's going to say that temet is yayin. Why? Because down the line it indeed ferments. Ad kan lo machayev Rabbi Yehuda el minei ubei, avol mi'alma lo. So in other words, within the temet itself, you have two, cups of temet. Within one cup itself, that's called minei ubei, Rabbi Yehuda holds that you could be mafresh. Why? Because mimonavshach. If it turns out that it didn't ferment down the line, so it's mayim. It didn't even need afrasha. There was no chiyuv masras at all. If, on the other hand, later on down the line it was machmitz, we'll say lemafreya that at the time that he separated the maser, it was already yayin, and therefore the hafrash is chal. But mi'alma lo, let's say he wants to be mafresh from one temed onto another temed, that he can't do. Why? Because he doesn't know for sure whether or not eventually it will become fermented. So therefore, he's taking a chance, and he's saying, well, maybe this will ferment and this will ferment if I can mafresh one on the other. No, you can't do that because you don't know whether the other one is going to ferment. If it doesn't ferment, then it's been aptur al achiyuv. And even if it ferments, it could be that this one here will not ferment, and therefore it's min aptur al achiyuv. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the brisa. Now, the following brisa that we're about to learn is a hemshech. It's a continuation of the sugya of temed. And we're talking now about temed ad shelo hichmitz. We're talking about this mixture of water with the sediments or the grape seeds of yayin, and what's the status of that water as far as Tara b'mikvah is concerned. So we're going to turn now to Amid Beis and we'll give an introduction to the next sugya about Temet.